Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Buzzanco and Scott Parkin.
Hi, I'm Bob Buzzanco, co-host of the Green and Red podcast. Today, like all of us, I was saddened to hear that Daniel Ellsberg had died. Ellsberg's life is well known, and he's one of the more important figures in the history of American dissent and American radicalism. He was a Marine in the 1950s, took a Ph.D. at Harvard, and then joined the Rand Corporation as an analyst in 1964. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara brought him in as an advisor to the Pentagon, and he was assigned to study pacification programs in Vietnam, along with the legendary General Edward Lansdale. Ellsberg early on concluded that the war wasn't going well and would continue to deteriorate with the possibility of victory for the Northern communist forces very real. In 1967, McNamara included Ellsberg in a group he created to conduct a comprehensive study of the entire history of the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, a role that would lead him to become one of the more dangerous men in America, according to U.S. government officials. After completing that study, in which Ellsberg didn't have a huge role, he returned back to the Rand Corporation and became immersed in anti-war work. By 1971, with the war still going on, despite public opposition, Ellsberg made copies of the 7,000-page report known as the Pentagon Papers and leaked it to the media. The Nixon administration immediately acted and charged Ellsberg with espionage, conspiracy, and other crimes. The White House also tried to prevent publication of the Pentagon Papers, but the Supreme Court upheld the right of the press to publish them. By the time Ellsberg went to trial, Nixon's attempts to discredit and ruin him, which included illegal wiretapping of Ellsberg, a government break-in of his psychiatrist's office, an offer by Nixon to the trial judge to appoint him director of the FBI if he found Ellsberg guilty, were so egregious that the judge threw out the charges against him before the trial began. From then on, Daniel Ellsberg was a constant presence when Americans protested against wars, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, intervention in Central America, U.S. meddling in the Middle East, basically issues all over the world. His legacy as a defender of press freedom and a voice for peace and justice won't be forgotten. We've seen his influence on the likes of Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Daniel Hale, Reality Winner, and many others who tried to warn us about the malignant actions of the state. In February 2003, I was really lucky and honored to host Dan Ellsberg in Houston, where he talked about the Vietnam War, nuclear weapons, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the coming war against Iraq. And he finished by talking about the case and the need for whistleblowers in government. And so as we remember Dan Ellsberg's magisterial contribution and legacy to the causes we care about, here are his words from 2003.
I'm Bob Buzzanco, a history professor here at the University of Houston. And over the past several months, I've had some really wonderful opportunities. On October the 18th, we had Noam Chomsky here in town, which was a great thrill. And today's guest certainly ranks right up there with that. You probably know a good deal about Dan Ellsberg already. He was an insider, Marine platoon, company commander, I believe. Worked in the Pentagon, and then in an act of courage, which we certainly see very rarely in our daily lives, let alone in government circles, he got copies of an internal research project that the Pentagon had been conducting, a history of the Vietnam War, and he meticulously copied it and brought it out, and he gave it to the press, to the media. And we found out more about the Vietnam War than we ever imagined, confirmed our worst fears about a very bleak and dark time in American history. As a historian, I can't tell you how much I appreciate this man. He made it possible for young scholars like me to study war in ways that otherwise we never would have. But even more than that, as somebody who cares about humanity, it shows what one person acting out of conscience can do. And that's something that's very rare and very touching. Something that we don't see very often today. whether it be in high circles of government or really at any other level. So to have Dan Ellsberg here speaking with us is indeed a rare honor on many different levels, and I am truly honored to be up here with him. Daniel Ellsberg.
I heard, Bob, this was scheduled as a sort of a conversation or something, not? Or how are we going to do this? How do you want to do it?
Well, I'll defer to you, okay? And
because, no, I was looking forward to a conversation.
well, I would love to have a conversation with you. I would be honored, but
well,
I'm humbled, and you know, people will laugh at the idea that I could be humble about anything. But,
well, let me tell them why I was anxious to see Bob. I was talking to Noam Chomsky a while ago, about a month ago on the phone, and he quoted to me, he said, "You've read Buzzanco's book, you know, Masters of War here." Okay, well, anyway, Chomsky said, "Oh, yeah, you've got to read." I said I hadn't read it, actually. And he said, I have it. It's one of many books I have on Vietnam that are in Washington that I haven't read yet. And he said, "Oh, you've got to read that. That's one of the best things there is." So there's a blurb for your next edition of this thing. And you can't get a better blurb than that. It cannot. So I was anxious, and I wanted him to send it to me before tonight, but I just got it last night. And I look forward to reading it. However, I see right away from the subtitle that it's a subject, military dissent and politics in the Vietnam era. And it's a subject I think that I'm very interested in and that deserves a lot more attention. So I'd be happy to focus on the subject of your book in particular, anyway. Namely, we do seem to be at a time right now when there is more dissent in the military part of the Defense Department than any time that I'm aware of up till now. It is true that in Vietnam there was almost universal dissent against the strategy that Lyndon Johnson was actually following. But he managed to keep the military hopeful that he would switch to their proposed strategy, the Joint Chiefs preference strategy. So that was one major thing that kept them from coming out publicly with a real split from the president. Now, in that case, I have to say that involved a lot of deception by the president, because he continuously implied that he was doing things with the full support and agreement of the Joint Chiefs, and in fact that he was simply following their recommendations. You know, sort of, I don't know much about politics, but I'm relying on what my military advisors have told me is necessary. On one occasion, crucial point, when he switched from a large but limited U.S. ground deployment in Vietnam, which was approaching 100,000 then, but was still limited to bases and certain cities, to ports and a few bases, and could have stayed limited, as some people were recommending, that it stay at that level and not take on the mission of going into the countryside, searching for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese troops in a full-scale ground war. So the going above that level of 100,000 was really a very crucial decision. Staying at that level would have meant a very limited role with limited casualties and not enormous pressure from the U.S. public necessarily to go much higher. But to go above that significantly was to go right into the ground war, to take heavy U.S. casualties. And once that was done, everybody understood there would be great pressure to go all the way. Now, the Joint Chiefs at that time wanted to go all the way, and all the way meant to them a very specific bunch of moves. It was almost like a catechism that they rolled out on every time they were asked for their recommendations. Their recommendations were to mobilize the reserves, to go on a level toward 500,000 to 600,000 troops or more, possibly 700,000, possibly 1 million. Those figures were mentioned explicitly in the spring of 1965. But in particular, to hit every target as close to simultaneously as they could on a, let's forget the number, 94, was it 91 target or 94 target list? What? 94 target list. The 94 target list, which they selected of targets to be hit in, I believe, April of 1964. 1964, that's before the election of November 1964. It's before the Tonkin Gulf incidents of August 1964. So they had 94 targets they wanted to hit as close to simultaneously as possible. Some of those were virtually on the border with China, between North Vietnam and China. A number of them were very close to that border. They also wanted to put troops into Laos and Cambodia. an expanded war, in short, which some thought were almost certain to bring the Chinese into the conflict, and which everyone conceded had a significant possibility of bringing the Chinese in. No one said the Chinese will not come in. Some said we don't think there's a high chance of it. But those were only a few military men who openly wanted to go into Vietnam. Most of the intelligence sources said doing the Joint Chiefs program will pretty surely, or almost surely, bring the Chinese in. In that case, by the way, there was unchallenged planning. All the planning, agreed to by the civilians as well as the military, was that we would use nuclear weapons against the Chinese. Or in the words, let me quote. This is Secretary of State Rusk on May 30th, 1964. This is again before the Tonkin Gulf. Civilian now, up to a point. He had been a colonel in the Asian theater during World War II and always thought of himself very much as in the terms of an Army staff planner. This is Secretary Dean Rusk, but he had been a civilian, of course, for a long time. He's saying that he had said the U.S. would never again get involved in a land war in Asia limited to conventional forces. Our population was 190 million. Mainland China had at least 700 million. We would not allow ourselves to be bled white, fighting them with conventional weapons. That meant that if escalation brought about major Chinese attack, it would also involve use of nuclear arms. Now, he was quoting what he had said. This was in a State Department cable back to Washington. What he had just said to Prime Minister, quote, General Nguyen Khan, who had taken power in a coup in Vietnam, and we were recognizing as the legitimate ruler of Vietnam because he had our backing. He had the mandate of heaven. And in this conversation then with Khan, he was asking him whether Khan had any reservations about the fact that we would have to use nuclear weapons if the Chinese came in. It's interesting, I mentioned this emphasis. I met Khan just a year ago, actually. He remembered this conversation, needless to say, quite well. And he had not seen the cable that Rusk had sent back, but I showed it to him and asked him if he had any comment on it. Top secret cable, of course, until I put it out in the Pentagon Papers. And his version was, well, the question was, do you have any problem with that? And he mentioned that Rusk had just discussed this with Chiang Kai-shek on Formosa, Taiwan. And he said many free leaders would oppose this. Chiang Kai-shek had told him fervently he did, and so did UN Secretary General U Thant. Many Asians, I'm quoting Rusk now, many Asians seem to see an element of racial discrimination in use of nuclear arms, something we would do to Asians but not to Westerners, as in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Rusk's version, now notice in the context of all this, the thought that we might be on the verge of using nuclear weapons in Asia again was not hinted at and would have been regarded as just unthinkable, unsayable, unimaginable to Americans. In fact, Goldwater was defeated that year in the greatest landslide of our history up till then, and really till now, unprecedented in many ways, in '64, because he indicated a willingness to use nuclear weapons. That was sort of the number one issue of the campaign, on which he was tarred with being virtually psychotic. Literally, I mean, many psychiatrists signed a letter that went around saying, from his statements, we regard him as, out of touch with reality and so forth. The fact that our Secretary of State, former head of the Rockefeller Foundation, was discussing this with foreign leaders, but not the U.S., would have not gone without notice, let's say. It doesn't mean Goldwater would have been elected, because it would be the same. He was even worse, you might say. But the landslide would have been very much eroded, and Johnson did not want that landslide eroded. So remember, this then was an assumption that we will use nuclear weapons if the Chinese come in. And the Joint Chiefs were definitely pushing and saying the only way you should fight this war, or they weren't quite ready to say that. They didn't say that. That's what they believed. But what they said was the best way, the right way to fight this is our way, which has a significant chance of bringing the Chinese in which case we will use nuclear weapons. Nobody disagreed with the latter point at that point. When General even McNamara said in an earlier quote from the Pentagon Papers, if the Chinese came in, there would be a serious question of having to use nuclear weapons at some point. This was actually 3 days after that cable I was just talking to you. Admiral Felt, CINCPAC, responded emphatically, there was no possible way to hold off the communists on the ground without the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and it was essential the commanders be given the freedom to use these as had been assumed in the various plans. Now, let me tell you something that's in this book but has not really been said before that I'm aware of. When you talk about freedom to use, that was literally the #1 issue of the campaign. The Goldwater had said that theater commanders should be given authority, delegated authority, to use tactical, or what he called conventional nuclear weapons. His phrase was small conventional nuclear weapons, meaning so-called tactical, short-range, relatively small weapons. They should be delegated the authority to use those on their own authority as needed, basically. And the answer to that led to the one-time use of the most famous of political ads, even now, of a little girl plucking petals off a daisy and a voice saying 10, 9, 8, 7, and at the end a mushroom cloud appears, blank, and then says the issues vote as if your life depended on it, you know, the issues are too great, something like that. Implying vote for Goldwater is a vote for possible use of nuclear weapons and possible delegation of the use of nuclear weapons. Now, a problem, and the president said on his opening speech in my hometown, Detroit, Cadillac Square on September 1st, 1964, there is no such thing as a conventional nuclear weapon, or these weapons are the size, McNamara actually said this the next day, these weapons are the size of Hiroshima or Nagasaki weapons, which is true, essentially still true. And he said that's not a small conventional nuclear weapon, there's no such thing. The president said, I have not and never will delegate that decision. You know, under any circumstances, that is the most consequential decision a president could ever have, and so forth. And I will never delegate it. But he had delegated it. I knew that. He knew that. Kennedy had delegated it, and Eisenhower before him. That was not widely known from that day till this, you might say. I discovered it under Eisenhower, working on command and control of nuclear weapons, reported it to the fact that such delegation did exist in writing, reported it to Kennedy's Assistant for National Security, George Bundy, who did not know it 1 month into the administration, delegated me, nominated me as a committee of one to task force of one, to pin down that written authorization, which I had been told about authoritatively in the Pacific. I couldn't find it, but it was found a few months later, 6 months into the Kennedy administration. They found the written authorizations from Eisenhower, delegating this not under all circumstances, but under circumstances where communications were cut off with Washington, or the president was incapacitated, as it happened twice with Eisenhower, with a heart attack and something else, a stroke or something. And of course, it's happened later with Reagan and various other presidents. That was the Haig's moment, you know, I am in charge, and so forth, which was wrong. Haig wasn't in charge, even at that point. So unclear as to who was in control. But in the late 50s and early 60s, throughout the 60s, there was in fact delegation, which the president was lying about, which each of these presidents had kept secret, lest the public worry. And an election in 1964 was essentially stolen on that and one other ground, namely, we seek no wider war by Johnson, at a time when I knew, along with hundreds to thousands of people in the administration, that we were going hell-bent for war as soon as the election was over. And the president could say, and his apologists still do say, well, he hadn't made the decision. True, in the sense that George W. Bush has not made the decision to go to war against Iraq. He hasn't decided whether he will use military means yet. But from the inside, one was prepared to bet that that's what was going to happen, and that he was in the course of deciding that. I was aware of that, as I say, I was aware of the delegation issue from before Johnson. And during this statement, as a matter of fact, I remember when he made that statement, I said to Adam Yarmolinsky in the Defense Department, have they changed the policy? And he said, you'd better find out. And I went down to the Joint Staff and looked at people I knew, and said, no, policy hasn't changed. That delegation still exists. Note that Goldwater's delegation would have been even worse. He just said, under all circumstances, give them that authority. Johnson had not done that. He had said, even to sack, though, that was for small tactical weapons. Johnson, like his predecessors, had said, under certain conditions, you have authority even to launch a full-scale attack against Russia with a Strategic Air Command. What are those circumstances now? What is the situation now? We don't know. Actually, there's never been a hearing on that. That's never been investigated. I do know that that delegation continued through most of Johnson's period, and I was told by others who have investigated this that it continued under each president, with the conditions being slightly changed under each one. Let's leap up to the present right now. Bush Sr., faced with the possibility that weapons would, in Russia, might get out of the control of the leader of Russia at the time of the abortive coup against Gorbachev. He rather hastily put out a set of measures which I really applaud him for very much under those circumstances. Right? He took SAC off alert. He took nuclear weapons off all American warships, and virtually every American warship had nuclear weapons. Anti-submarine weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, and the carriers with planes on all had nuclear bombs for their, and missiles for their bombers. He took them all off and asked for the Soviet Union to do the same. In other words, he assumed to wait for them to do it or to agree bilaterally is to wait too long. The Soviet Union is falling apart. He moved very fast, and he said, if we do it unilaterally, they may find themselves able to imitate that right away. This was right after the coup. Gorbachev was still in power before Yeltsin. And Gorbachev did imitate that right away. Took all weapons off Russian ships, took weapons off alert in Russia, and took all the weapons, actually the tactical weapons, brought them back into Russia. At least ordered that away from Kazakhstan, some of the other places now. A marvelous move toward stability, actually. Question. That was by executive order, of course. Question in my mind is this. We have an administration now under Bush Jr. heading toward war in Iraq, which has openly announced its readiness to use nuclear weapons first, tactical nuclear weapons, under several circumstances. First, against underground sites that cannot be attacked by conventional weapons, command and control sites, storage sites for gas, storage sites for biological or chemical weapons, and so forth, especially command and control. Like the bunker that we hit in Baghdad that was in fact filled with civilians during the Gulf War, but we thought might have Saddam in it. We used a special bomb for that, but for an even stronger bunker, we would want, he says, a small nuclear weapon. To reply to any use of biological or chemical weapons or nuclear, but we assume so far, even Bush has said, that they don't have nuclear weapons now. That could be wrong, by the way. Very unlikely that they have produced any nuclear weapons. But have they bought a nuclear weapon, blackmail from Russia? We wouldn't necessarily know that. And Saddam wouldn't necessarily yet have told us that, by the way, is another story. But anyway, if chemical or gas, which they may well use against our forces, we are ready to use nuclear weapons against them. Third, in case of surprising developments. Well, I mean, we can neglect that. I mean, we're talking about war. You can't expect surprises in war, right? So, I don't know, when would a surprising development occur? I don't know. But anyway, they allowed that possibility as well. So I have a simple question here. Where are our nuclear weapons now? Have they gone back on the ships? Would we necessarily have been told? No. Flat no on that. Where will the nuclear weapons come from? Well, they could be transported from the U.S., but will we really wait that long necessarily? I think our press should definitely be asking right now, are those carriers in the Gulf, short range, right close to them, are they without nuclear weapons or not? The reason that's very interesting, by the way, is that it was a wonderful move for George Bush Sr. to have taken them off. The chance then that of an accident, the chance of a mistaken use of those weapons was very greatly reduced, and the precedent, the example set to the Russians and others was very strong. First, to put them back on navies is a tremendously bad move, even if war should be averted now, to put those back. That may well have happened at this point. Okay, I brought up a number of points here. The current possible use of nuclear weapons is more explicit than it ever has been before. But in circumstances like this, in limited war, the fact that such discussion is going on and is revealed by leaks to the LA Times last week, a week before Sunday, that there is currently a small military group reporting to Rumsfeld, working under Rumsfeld, picking targets for the use of nuclear weapons in this war. Now, that fact, by the way, we wouldn't know without an unauthorized leak of obviously top secret or higher than top secret information. I think it is good to know that. There hasn't actually been a massive outcry against that. It's not impossible that it was even an authorized leak, a trial balloon, to see whether the public was very concerned about that. Certainly, if the weapons are used, Bush will be able to say, and will say, we said it publicly, we did not exclude any weapons, we've said massive consequences. The public has been informed through the LA Times and others that this planning has been going on. We didn't surprise you. What's the surprise? Is there any outrage? Would there be outrage? Actually, they're counting, I just read today in one of these papers I was reading, that they're still saying that a use against an underground bunker would be without civilian or collateral damage because it wouldn't reach the surface and would not cause fallout. Apparently the Defense Department is putting that out. You know, it buries itself underground. And the explosion, like a test explosion in Nevada, would be entirely contained. That is false. We have no such weapon. The bunkers, the explosions in Nevada are thousands of feet, or 1,000 feet or so beneath the ground. You know, they tunnel down there, they bring the thing out in a cave, in a tunnel, with very great preparation that takes months and months to prepare. A burrowing warhead does not achieve that. It will, in fact, throw up 1,000 tons and more of irradiated dirt and cause a great fallout and great civilian damage. There undoubtedly are military men now as before who believe that all of this is a very bad idea and are against it. In fact, that could be true of the very people picking targets right now who have been given that honored job. Some of them, I've known plenty of targeteers for the strategic planning, which I was involved in, who thought that this was insane and crazy, but that was their job. And at the end of the day, they went home and had dinner with their families. And during the day, they planned the incineration under certain circumstances of millions of people. And those circumstances were not ever exclusively retaliation to nuclear attack. Our planning has in fact always been based on preemption, which was to get in the first blow if possible, if a nuclear war seemed imminent. If there seems likelihood that we are about to be attacked, our planning has always been based on what was called preempting. Always. But George W. Bush and his administration have totally abused and misled the American public now in calling the war he's planning against Iraq preemptive, which has always been used to mean to preempt, to what's another word, to forestall, to act first against an imminent or ongoing armed attack. He's using that word, which has been in our policy always, to refer to a preventive war, and even that's a euphemism. It's an aggressive war, an initiative war, a war of choice. A war is an instrument. A war, an unprovoked war, let's say. Well, is anything totally unprovoked? Saddam is provoking us for sure by, in just a great variety of ways, by not giving us full access, let's say, to his sites or whatever. But or in the eyes of the Muslim world, by being Muslim, and by not being our subordinate, by no longer being a clearly subordinate and compliant barony, sort of, in our hegemony. Very provocative. But anyway, it's a preventive war we're talking about. Our policy has not been based on preventive war, otherwise known as aggressive war. The UN Charter does not allow any war to be conducted under the circumstances we are now facing. And in fact, if the whole Security Council were to okay it, that would be in violation of the UN Charter. But you'd still say, well, they have modified the conditions, the Charter. It has UN authorization. Without UN authorization, without Security Council authorization, or in the face of the veto, it would be or will be a pure, straightforward, aggressive war, as clearly as Saddam Hussein's attack on Kuwait. And that's a lot clearer than wars usually get, or aggressions usually get. Vietnam was never, no matter how unwise and imprudent and reckless and ill-conceived, it never was as clear to the public or most insiders as aggression as this would be. It had the cover of our being invited in, but by what we called, and most people believed, was a sovereign state of South Vietnam, which in fact was an agent of the U.S. government, essentially, a puppet, fairly called. But it did have the appearance that we were called in to support and protect a sovereign state, and that protected it from an appearance of aggression to most people. This doesn't have that cover. Nobody's inviting us in. Some dissenters, some Iraqi defectors, emigres, and I'm not putting them down, but outside Iraq have invited us to go kill those guys for them and for democracy and for various other things. But we're not being invited in by anybody, and the UN hasn't authorized it. At the same time, this particular aggression, by the way, a pretty good case could be made against aggression in Grenada or Panama, in fact, a perfectly good case, but especially Panama, for example. But small, fast, over. Small in the sense that we're in Panama, we don't know how many died. We never counted. We denied accounts. At least 1,000 civilians died, as far from all the counts I've seen. But we've never really seen a body counting that. But in any case, that's over fast, relatively, and don't count. This is a war, except in one other sense. The war being planned is now a war that nobody's ever seen before, starting with 6 to 800 cruise missiles in the first 2 days. 300 to 400 in the first day, which is more than we launched in all of the Gulf War. So twice as many in the first 2 days, along with thousands of other precision-guided munitions. Their hope is, then, to a war that will be so fast that shock and awe is the name of this strategy. It used to be called blitzkrieg, but this is the modern form of blitzkrieg, where we disorganize all the command and control, hopefully kill Saddam and all his doubles, wherever they are. I would think, by the way, it would be kind of difficult to assure the Iraqis that they don't have their great leader anymore commanding them and threatening them. We've killed them. Because even if we've killed the 5 or 6 we know of, I don't know why he wouldn't have 4 or 5 others ready to pop up, in effect, on television and say, no, I'm still here. How would we disprove that? Paul could go before the UN and say, no, don't believe it, that man is an imposter. But apparently we can't tell one double from another on television anyway. So that's a small footnote. But the idea is that we kill them, we disorganize them, they give up quickly, and it's over very fast. We hit all their military targets, meaning that we killed not just 91, 94 targets literally simultaneously, but 300, 500. As my wife put it when she read this plan, the shock and awe plan, which is to demoralize them, they said, we're wrong to keep calling this a war. This is just a massacre. As was, of course, the first Gulf War was essentially a massacre. 100 Americans, 120 Americans died, mostly friendly fire, mostly by our own fire. 100,000 Iraqis are killed military, and several thousand, 3,000 to 10,000 civilians. It was a massacre, sort of like the old colonial wars, or Agincourt, Henry V's Great War. Right now, but in that case, by the way, the reason, at least one major reason that the death toll on the US side and the Iraqi side was not much larger was that Bush Sr. chose not to go to Baghdad to test whether the Iraqis would fight better defending Baghdad than they did defending Kuwait, which they did defect. Whether the Revolutionary Guard would in fact fight better in their homeland than the draftees did in Kuwait. He chose not to find out on that without UN permission. And his son is about to make that test now. So the death toll could very well be greater, and one reason that the military clearly are very concerned about this is that now as then, they are not so confident as Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld are, it seems, that urban fighting will be avoided, that we won't have to fight in Baghdad. Now, city fighting, have any of you seen, by the way, the movie, extremely good movie, The Pianist? About city fighting in Germany. And then what was that? There was a good, not such a good movie, about snipers in Stalingrad, I think it was. What was the name of that? The Enemy at the Gates? Yeah, city fighting. And Black Hawk Down, you seen that? If you've seen that, you have a pretty good sense of what city fighting looks like. I was trained very cursorily in the Marines for city fighting. The Marines up till that time hadn't done a whole lot of city fighting. We were trained for it and got a very clear picture from that already. City fighting is not something that anybody does well. It's very, very bloody, messy business on both sides, with all the civilians getting killed and the city being destroyed. With Baghdad, if that happens, this will be a very, very bloody war. The military are not confident that it won't happen. Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Pearl, all people who have never allowed themselves to be near firing, shooting, are very confident how this thing is going to work out and that there won't be city fighting. But their judgment really isn't to be relied on very much. And it's not that the military know all the answers either. What they do know, and what even I know, I've been close enough to a war to know in Vietnam, is the uncertainty of it and the impossibility of predicting with this kind of confidence that they seem to show, the recklessness of it. So this particular aggression, like so many aggressions in the past, may go very fast. Maybe it'll be like Hitler in France, which is what they're planning, a Guderian-like blitzkrieg. Shooting, by the way, they're imitating, I don't know, I'm going off here a little bit, but their actual planning is literally for General Guderian was in charge of the blitzkrieg through the Ardennes in France, which defeated France very well. And he did that by shooting his tanks through against all past military planning, getting ahead of their supplies, moving fast, not waiting for the trucks to bring up fuel and bring up. That's exactly what they're planning right now. Against the instincts of our military, the Rumsfeld and Cheney, all the leaks have been showing is that their plan is for our tanks to be dropped in some cases, later tanks, later vehicles, dropped in to move ahead of the fuel, bring the fuel up later with air and so forth, keep moving in blitzkrieg. Same plan. May work. And it may not. Just simply may not work that well. And the military are very nervous about it and concerned about it. The point, okay, what I'm just saying, the relation to this is this. Should we expect the military, literally expect, that military who feel that both wrongful and terribly unwise and reckless, that it exposes our troops and our country to great risks, unwarranted risks, should we expect them to do everything they could to stop it? Well, the answer is no, by all experience. They are leaking to some extent, which I think is very good and credible. But these are disconnected stories that come out here and there. I'm not even sure, for instance, that LA Times story has been repeated very much. If you don't happen to get it in the LA Times or in the internet, I'm not sure at all. A reader, did the Houston Chronicle see it or not? I don't know. Did the Houston Chronicle have this story? Interestingly, I saw a reference to the Houston Chronicle talking about nuclear planning a couple of years ago, in 1991. I just saw that the other day. I would have asked for that file at the Houston Chronicle this morning, except they backed off from the proposal that I speak to their board. They said they didn't need to talk about the war anymore. They'd heard enough, and which that didn't sound too good to me, actually. I wouldn't have minded hearing we're too busy with other things, with the Columbia or something, or don't have it in our schedule. But the word that came back was, "We've heard enough about the war." Did not have a good ring to me. We're 2 weeks, maybe 6 weeks at the most, away from what may be a disastrous war, which probably will be a catastrophic war, and which at best will be a massacre. The best planning from those 3,000 precision-guided munitions, the 800 cruise missiles and so forth, it's almost unimaginable that they will kill fewer than 3,000 innocent civilians. In other words, their best calculation, we will kill more innocents than were killed by Al-Qaeda in the World Trade Center. But that's the best. And what about the tens or hundreds of thousands of Iraqi draftees who get killed in the course of this? Just what did they do to us or anyone else that got them sentenced to death? Who's the aggressor there? We're the aggressor. It would seem to me that we should not measure the human cost of this war entirely in American lives or entirely in civilian lives. Actually, the Iraqi draftees, hapless draftees who would be killed with their families if they refused to be in the army, the ones who were killed will leave wives and children and relatives grieving, just like the relatives of the Columbia and the World Trade Center. Families just very like them. And many of them will go too at the same time. And one might have hoped that the pictures we see of these people and their families before death that we've been seeing over the last year might have put in the minds of Americans that these humans we're about to kill in Iraq and the innocent humans killed in Afghanistan have stories that are just like these. You know, if you saw some of those little anecdotes about some of them, they told jokes and they did sports in this particular way and people liked them or didn't like them for this reason and that. And they're gone very fast. There are a lot of people walking about in Baghdad today, mothers and children and army and soldiers, who will be dead 2 months from now by American weapons. For what? Well, not for any of the reasons the president is saying, not for any of them. Oil is a major aspect of that, and that's not insignificant. War for oil? Why not? That's what our leaders are thinking, I'm sure, but they're not saying that. You know, what else? If that isn't worth fighting for, you know, what could possibly be worth fighting for? Well, the American public as a whole doesn't accept that equation, that you should kill people to get their oil. as a sign I saw in a rally recently in January 18th, said, "How did our oil get under their sand?" You know, that's the philosophy we're going under, you know. But that doesn't sell too well. So the reasons being given that Saddam is the #1 danger in the world, that's ridiculous. And that's what our president looks us in the eye and has said over and over. #1 danger, first of all, in a world with Al-Qaeda in it, a world in which, second, that he's linked to Al-Qaeda, that would give some substance to the notion that he's a #1 danger. Al-Qaeda is a very high danger, except the CIA says they can't find any evidence of a link. And the FBI has not been able to find any evidence of a link. So the statement that they are linked, or that the president has evidence that the CIA doesn't have, is almost certainly a lie. But the notion, even so, even if, that Saddam is the #1 danger, is a ridiculous lie. Haven't we? If you read about North Korea and its nuclear weapons, a world in which Russia has tens of thousands of unguarded, relatively unguarded nuclear weapons, the India-Pakistan dispute, Arab-Israeli dispute, and so forth. Saddam is a danger. Saddam, weakened by this war, by the 11-year-old war, much weaker than before, inspected for 10 years so that he almost surely does not have any long-range missiles, even capable of hitting Israel. A force a third as large as it was before. Contained, surrounded by American bases and troops now who are clearly itching, with an American president clearly itching to attack him, which has been attacking him even under Clinton. Saddam is not on the list of dangers to the United States. He's not a danger to the United States. He's a dictator, he's a tyrant, he's a brute, and so forth, who is not a danger to the United States, period, contained as he is. Conceivably would be under some decade of non-inspection. And if we left the area entirely, we're not about to leave the area, that's where the oil is. So Saddam is not among our dangers. We have some real other dangers. He's not one of them. So we're going to implant democracy there. That's our notion. There isn't a chance we will allow democracy in Iraq, that we will allow democracy, which could lead to a Shiite majority, having a Shiite regime that would ally itself with Iran, or at least to some degree accommodate to Iran. That will not be allowed by us. The Kurds, I just read this morning, the Turks are likely to come in. It's hard to avoid. The black humor here is really something. This morning I just read, the Turks are planning after all to join us and to send troops into northern Iraq. Why? Well, you know, why? Where the Kurdish areas, to prevent the Kurds from having an independent state. See? So our NATO ally, the Turks, are going to invade Iraq for us to keep the Kurds down, not to liberate the Kurds, lest those Kurds have give the idea of some independence for the Turkish Kurds. The Kurds are going to be screwed again, in effect, and occupied this time by Turks rather than by Saddam. We're going to leave in a year or two and leave the oil fields to a regime, however democratic, that may again sell to China directly instead of through us, or to Germany, whatever. Not a chance. So the idea that we're going in there for democracy is, I would say, there is no chance of that. That's a conscious hoax. Okay. How about the civilians then, and the military, who have documents in there that give the lie to these presidential statements, as documents abounded in my period? I quote quite a few of them from the Pentagon Papers that showed that the president was lying then. What will people do about that? Well, they'll do what I did in 64, 65. They will note them, understand that the public is being lied to, and they will do their job, whatever it is. As I did keep my mouth shut in 64, 65, 66, 67, 68. And 5 years after I first read those documents, I did copy them and give them to the Senate. They didn't do anything with them. And a year and a half later, after 2 more invasions, I gave them to the various newspapers. One after another of which actually then defied the president who was saying that this publication hurt our national security. This was in a war, and the president said this is an immediate danger to national security, so much so that I must enjoin these papers from publishing them at all. It has never been done before, but this is a crisis. That's what the president said. And in the face of that statement, this was 71, in the face of that judgment and an injunction on the Times and then the Post, 17 other newspapers after the Post was enjoined used their own judgment and defied the president and continued to publish their own. The Boston Globe was enjoined, various others published. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch was enjoined eventually. There were 4 altogether before they gave up enjoining. My wife and I were underground at this point, not real deep. We were in Cambridge the whole time, going from house to house, while the FBI conducted what they said was the largest manhunt since the Lindbergh kidnapping. But fortunately, that was the FBI, so we continued to put out, they were looking in Bermuda, I read, and California and south of France, and I don't know. I had a feeling that some junketing was going on in the course of this. But anyway, the papers did continue to come out, and the newspapers used their own judgment as to what was in the public interest and what was national security. And I would say a brilliant moment of American freedom and American press freedom and the First Amendment. And ultimately, the Supreme Court, partly realizing that there was no way of stopping the publication, did rule 6-3 that the publication could continue. I think, by the way, that if the newspapers hadn't been willing to keep doing that, and if I hadn't had other copies to keep giving them, and if we hadn't if the FBI had stopped them, et cetera, et cetera. If those papers hadn't been coming out, I think the Supreme Court would have ruled. I've never seen this point made, by the way. It seems pretty obvious to me. The Supreme Court would have ruled at least 5-4 for maintaining the injunction. If, in other words, it was possible to keep those papers under wraps, they would have given the benefit of the doubt. 5 of them would have. 3 or 4 of the judges would have said no. They said right away. Justice Douglas and Black and a couple of others would have said the state has no right to enjoin these, period. That's what the First Amendment says. But probably 5 or 6 judges would have said yes. But given this large-scale civil disobedience, which I knew I was doing, I expected to go to prison for the rest of my life, and I was directly ready to do that because of the example of young Americans who were doing that with their lives, and they were doing it in the spirit of Thoreau and Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And I had just been reading those sources. I'd met somebody who'd induced me to read Thoreau, Essay on Civil Disobedience, and Gandhi's Stride Toward Freedom, and Joan Bondurant's The Conquest of Violence on Gandhi and Nonviolence, and a lot of Gandhi. I'd read all that, and then I met people who were living it and who were going to jail prison, rather than take part in a war they knew was wrong. So that put the idea in my head, all right, I've been against this war for some years now. As an insider, I've said to inside people what I thought. I've done all the things that were consistent with my keeping my career. And I hadn't, by the way, consciously made that any condition. And nobody does, really. I'll do everything I can if it doesn't hurt my career. You just instinctively don't think of things that would clearly lose your access, lose your influence, put you out of the game, keep you from helping humanity by serving the president. If you have that opportunity, you just don't think of alternatives as possibilities that would conflict with that. And when I met these people who were going to prison, instead of going to Canada or being COs or just going to Vietnam or Germany, who were saying, no, this is wrong, and I want to make it plain, to tell the truth to the public. I think it's wrong, so wrong that I will not participate in it, will not collaborate with it, even to the extent of becoming a CO under the rules. Then I said to myself, all right, What could I do now that I'm ready to pay any price in my own life, now that I'm ready to go to jail, ready to do whatever, ready to give up my career? Now, what could I think of? And I thought of a number of things, of which copying the Pentagon Papers was just one, and it didn't look like the most promising one, actually, because they dealt with history. They ended in '68. This was now '69 under Nixon. So I thought, well, this history doesn't have a high chance of changing anything. But it was all I had, and it was one thing I did, and I tried some other methods as well. All this is leading up to saying is that the military people and the civilians who then as now saw clearly that we were heading toward a catastrophe did often quite a bit, but on the whole, nothing that conflicted with their own advancement. And I don't think that was because they were less conscientious than I was or anybody else or bad people. I really don't think they thought about it. It even occurred to them to do otherwise. I'm trying now, in the last several months, to put that idea in the heads of people to the extent I can reach them, and especially in Washington, and I hope to do that in the next couple of weeks, actually, go to Washington and get it in their minds as much as I can. I think there are probably several 101 people who could avert this war. The one is Saddam, if he decided radically to just say, okay, come on in, I'll meet all your conditions. That wouldn't guarantee no occupation or no war even, because there could still be a Tonkin Gulf incident trumped up of some kind, but it would go pretty far. It would lower the chances very strikingly. I wish he would do that. Or he could leave, and his successors could invite the U.S. in to occupy the oil field. I would prefer that to war, for sure. Then there are several hundred Americans, I think, who could probably avert this war, if Saddam doesn't do that, which is unlikely that he will. Starting with Powell, who I think will not do this, there are several hundred people at my old level or higher. I was a GS-18, but you don't have to be that high, a special assistant, which I was, to an assistant secretary, a deputy assistant secretary, state, defense, CIA, a colonel in the staff at that level, who has access to the kind of information I had. There are hundreds of such people. Current information that would give the lie to what the president is saying, that will, for example, and that will show, by the way, the absence of documents that would support what the president is saying. When the president says that Saddam Powell said the other day, Powell is joined up. Is this a terrible thing? No, very few people have ever acted otherwise. In fact, nobody has ever really done what I'm suggesting. I didn't have current documents. If I had had current documents, I would have put those out instead of the Pentagon Papers, but I didn't have them. Nixon feared I had them, with good reason. I could have, but I didn't. He feared I had them, and that's why he took criminal measures to shut me up, to keep me from putting out documents on his administration. That's told in the last couple chapters of my book here. I didn't know it at the time. And those criminal measures brought him down when they were exposed. So it turned out that my truth-telling and the threat that I might have more truth to tell did lead to a chain of events from the administration, from the president, that in fact helped end the war. It got Nixon out of office, got the bombing cut off in Congress, and did help shorten the war in kind of an unforeseeable way, non-violently and truthfully. Well, I think if these people took current documents, and what I'm suggesting to them is they do what I wish I had done in August of 1964, rather than October of '69, 5 years later. Don't wait till the bombs are falling. Take those documents to Congress and the press, give them the documents, put them out, and tell the truth. Any one, I'd say, of hundreds of people could do that in a way I think that would make it impossible for the president to pretend that there is any justification for this war, and to pretend that the war is sure to be cheap and other than catastrophic. I have hope that there could be somebody who will do that. It isn't a very high hope, but it's enough to work on. Anyway, I think the lesson from your book, in a way, what I've seen, I look forward to reading it, and I just glanced through it last night, but I could already see the references, some of which I knew and some are new to me, on the amount of dissent there was among the military. And when a policy is being pursued that depends upon secrecy because it is so catastrophic, so reckless, not because it's certain to fail, but because it might very well fail, it fails so badly. It has to be kept secret because it would be opposed. That policy is vulnerable to a single person telling the truth. And that's why they take such measures to prevent such a person. But among those measures is they sustain a norm, an ethic in the society that assures that person that he or she will be reviled as a traitor or a coward, as a snitch, an informer, bad person. So they just don't think of it. Well, I'd like to see those norms changed and people understand, so I'm very happy to see that Time cover story. Persons of the Year, 3 whistleblowers at the end of the year. Very good. Strictly speaking, I want to see them recognized. Strictly speaking, 2 of those women were not whistleblowers in a technical sense. They told the truth to their bosses, which was good, but not that uncommon. That's not inconsistent with getting ahead, or certainly with keeping your job, if you keep your mouth shut to the outside world, to the investigators, to the Congress, to the monitors. You show your loyalty by doing that. 2 of the 3 did exactly that. They told the boss and didn't tell anybody else at Enron and at WorldCom. They did nothing to protect the investors, which was all that was involved there, from this financial catastrophe that lay ahead, and the bosses did nothing with what they were told. The 3rd, Colleen Rowley, was a real whistleblower. She took her information to Congress, and it got out. And whoever put it out, whether it was her or someone else, did a very good service. And I like to see that recognized. Finally, then, the question for these people in the military that you talked about, the military now, especially the civilians who know this sort of thing, and for all of us here who don't have safes full of secret documents, we will be asking ourselves 2 months from now, I think, did I do everything I could to avert this? And the test of that, that's what people should be asking themselves. It isn't too common that people do ask themselves that, but this will be so awful that I think a lot of people who knew already the war was wrong, will be asking themselves, could I have done more? It's a good question. Nobody can ever say there was nothing more I could have done. I don't know what. But should I have done more? And the test of that really in part is, were there things that I could have done that might have helped, that did involve some risk to my income, my credibility, my reputation, my relationships, my job? Not that you had to do that. Everybody has to weigh, is this worth that? But I am suggesting that people do ask the question, is this worth that? Certainly, where so many lives are at stake, it can be worthwhile to risk one's own career in the way that so many humans are going to be risking their lives. And can truth-telling, which is available to all of us in one way or another, have an effect? Well, people will say, no. I'm a little person, I don't have that much truth, it won't have any effect. I certainly can't say that. I know that the truth-telling had an effect on my life by other people, telling their truth that the war was wrong, and that my truth-telling in turn looked as though it had no effect for quite a while, but it turned out it had a big. So you can't foresee entirely, but at any rate, that's the thought I want to give you. I didn't let you. How are we on?
score. Not for fame, not for riches, not for glory. He's the man who leaked the truth about the war. Well, this man worked for a giant corporation whose main job is keeping secrets in a hush. He was aware of all the problems in the nation, sick and tired of all this beating round the bush. His position called for access to the files of some things that ought to make some folks ashamed. Sneak them out of all those quiet guarded files and expose them all the ones who should be blamed. Now the government has got him by the collar. You've gotta pay 'cause you've done wrong, my little man. 2-3 years locked up in jail for this great scholar, for upsetting all the people in the land. That's the story of the man who leaked the story of a man who let the people know the score. Not for fame, not for riches, not for glory. Told the people of the truth behind the war. Told the people of the truth behind